Saint Bernardine of Siena was a Franciscan who lived in the 15th century, and he was a great preacher. He was once asked if a Christian community for 20 years could have only one thing or the other, either 20 years of good preaching with no access to the Mass and the Eucharist, or 20 years of access to the Mass but bad preaching, which would be better? St. Bernardine's answer without hesitation was that it would be better to have 20 years of good preaching. And his reason why St. Bernardine said that was that he was convinced that after 20 years of having the Eucharist with bad preaching, the people would no longer understand the importance of the Mass and would take the Eucharist for granted. Whereas after 20 years of good preaching without the Mass, the people would be eager to come to Mass and hungering for the sacraments. That's kind of been the experience of the Church over the last 30, 40 years. St. Bernardine prediction seems to have been verified. Catholics now for a few decades have had, with some notable exceptions, bad preaching. And none of us has really been spared. But it's also, the Church has universal access to Holy Communion. Catholics receive communion sometimes in spite of their moral state. And the majority of Catholics take the Eucharist for granted. On the other hand, there's a movement of Protestant conversions to the Church, hungering for the Eucharist, thirsting for the precious blood of Christ. They say salt preserves, and Catholic preaching as a whole has not been very salty. Salt has a sting to it. It's a strong, a bite to it. The majority of Catholics seem to think the Church is a society of independent thinkers rather than a communion that Jesus Christ himself established on the rock of Peter. And in turn, the salt will preserve the culture. A culture without heavy doses of the Church's salt will soon be a festering, corrupted corpse. We say when we lose our saltiness, the world goes flat, like food without salt is flat. When the Church blends in with the world, the Church loses its identity, its purpose. There's that confession of a lapsed Catholic who says, I'd rather be alienated from an institution that stands for something than belong to one that would accommodate itself to lazy, secular me. Respecting the gold standard of truth, not compromising it, even though we may not completely understand it, striving to live out that standard. Like we say, the world becomes flat and dark without the light and the salt. One woman writes that the explicit teaching of right and wrong, the clarity of distinction between right and wrong, is the greatest, most wonderful gift we can pass on to our children, because it's the foundation of their happiness in this life. If we don't give them that distinction, that sense of right and wrong, we deny them the chance to ever be happy. St. Paul says, how can we believe if we have not heard? How can we hear without a preacher? They say preaching is a graced word. It has power to penetrate. It has power to ignite. It has power to confer the light of truth. St. Augustine says, when the truth is spoken, a grace is given. A grace to receive the truth, a grace to become light and salt ourselves, to preserve and illumine the world in turn. So like we say, in a worried world, the Christian is the one who remains serene. In a depressed world, the Christian should be the one who remains radiant with joy. Like we say, if we are to be the salt of the earth, we must diffuse that light and salt. The light which the Christian shares is a borrowed light. We must shine with the reflection of his light. Just like the moon reflects the light of the sun, we too reflect the light of Christ in our words and in our actions. Someone once said that there can be no such thing as a secret discipleship, because either the secrecy destroys the discipleship or the discipleship destroys the secrecy. Okay? Like they say, I cannot hear the words you're saying because your actions speak so loudly. So we ask God for that grace to be salt and light. Salt and light in a world gone dark and flat. We pray for that grace to live our faith out loud, to preach not only in word, but by our lives.